My name is Josh Kullis. I'm the Technical Services Manager at Auros Knowledge Systems. And what we wanted to do over the next 30, 45 minutes for this breakout session is take a deeper look into some of the technologies that Jeff was talking about. So at a conceptual level, we talked about what knowledge packets are, what assessment controls are, but we want to take this time to kind of get deeper into that a little bit and start to understand how we can actually identify them within our organization. So the learning points for this particular session is how do you identify an assessment control? What do those assessment controls potentially look like? How do we identify knowledge packets? And then what do those look like? So these things can manifest themselves in a lot of different ways. And sometimes it's difficult for organizations or for people within an organization to understand how to take the concept and apply it to what they're trying to do. So we'll walk through some of that stuff and we'll want to talk about how to do that in a more practical manner. So the first thing that we want to do is we have a polling question for you guys. So if you take open your app, there's going to be a session. So you're either beginner or advanced session. If you click on the advanced session, it will allow you to look at the polling question for this particular session. Okay. So the question that we have, we're having some technical difficulties getting it on the screen, but the question that we have is in the past 30 days, have you used a checklist in anything that you do within your organization? So it's yes, no. I'll hope that the guys in the back can tell me what the answers are. If not, I'll just make them up and say that they are what we expected them to be. So we anticipate that most people are going to say yes to this question. Checklists are pretty prevalent within an organization. We see a lot of checklists done. If you're familiar with the Checklist Manifesto, which is a book written about their value and how powerful they can be, you know that they can help us accomplish a lot of things. They can help the human brain remember things that it might not have the capacity to remember all the time. So one of the first things that you can do to identify where assessment controls are in your organization is identify checklists that are used. That's going to be the first thing that we'll talk about. The second thing that we'll talk about and the second example that we'll use is any time that you have multiple stakeholders that are coming together and they're trying to make a decision or influence a decision, and then that decision needs to be tracked and monitored for audit purposes or for historical reasons if you need to look back and see what decision was made, that's another place where an assessment control can be valuable. So if we have something that people need to come together on, that is a place where you could use an assessment control. The third one is going to be any standard process that you have. So if you have a standard process that you're supposed to follow, people need to know how to follow that process, what goes into the process. That's another area that you could use an assessment control. And then we split these two things up into two categories. The fourth one is standard work. So standard process and standard work. A standard process could be considered standard work, but we split them up because there's two very different ways that we can accomplish those things using the Auros software. So those are the four things that we'll kind of talk about when it comes to the way you can identify assessment controls. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the checklist. So we have customers that use assessment controls for something that they call Workstation Readiness. So there are manufacturing plants. Those manufacturing plants have stations within them, and those stations need to be ready so that when the line goes, all the equipment and the setup is put in the right place, and the line doesn't have to come down. So the way they do that is they have a checklist. People go out into the plant, and they make sure that 20, 30 different things are actually in place, right? So with Auros, we take that checklist and we turn it into an assessment control, and it's going to look something like what's on the screen right now. So it looks very similar to the checklist that might be in Excel or it might be in some other sort of document, but we're going to have on the first column on the left, we're going to see our conformance state. So is this thing in the right place? Is it not in the right place? We then have the thing that's being checked. So are our ergomats in place? Are the safety signs posted? These are the different items that we need to go through and make sure in place, so that when the line starts up, if there's a problem, the safety materials are there. All that kind of stuff. So this group took their checklists, they were able to turn them into assessment controls, and they look very similar to what we see here on the screen. So that's our first example of a real-life workflow where they had Excel checklists and they turned them into assessment controls. So the second example that we'll talk about is the decision-making process, right? So you may have design guidelines or requirements that you have to meet, We have a lot of different groups that do that. And they need to have people write those design guidelines. Those are the subject matter experts. And then designers have to take those into account when they're actually designing the parts. So when we have a design guideline or product development work, the assessment control is going to look like this. So it's very similar to the checklist. One of the things that Auros is really good at is reducing the amount of ways that people capture knowledge and the ways they consume it and the way they evaluate it. We want to make that consistent so that it's easier for the end user, whether they're applying a design guideline, filling out a checklist, going through standard work. We want to take the necessity to understand what they're actually doing and how they're filling the form out. We want to take that out of the process so that it's consistent across all those different workflows. So this looks very similar to the Workstation Readiness checklist, but we have design guidelines that users need to then adhere to. So they come in, they can see the multimedia image, they still have the title of what it is that they're trying to adhere to, and all that information is displayed in a similar way that the Workstation Readiness checklist was. So the third thing that we're going to look at, I think we have another polling question. That's good to go. So let's go to the next polling question. So this was the first one. So we did get that people use checklists. That was good. So the second polling question, oh, people already answered. Right on. Does your organization define a standard process? So do you have processes that you're supposed to follow? Follow-up question for that, right? So with 13 votes, we have 12 that said they do, 1 that said they don't. That's okay. We can help you get processes. But your standard process is going to be something that could also be an assessment control. So we have internally at Auros, we have a process that we follow when we do implementations. We call our initial implementations a seed project. And we have a process that we follow to make sure that best practices are adhered to and that people are able to not make the mistakes that we've made in the past. So for us, we've turned that into an assessment control, and it looks something like this. So Jeff showed a couple of these kinds of knowledge packets, the decision flows or the workflows that we have. And this is what our actual seed process looks like. So when our application engineers go into an organization, they're going to take this particular process and they're going to actually go through and fill it out as they're implementing the software. So for us, there were a lot of things that we found were inconsistent as we started to go through doing these implementations. And maybe one application engineer had knowledge about how to scope the project out that another application engineer didn't know because they weren't there and experienced that. So with this, we're able to capture those best practices, and then as we're doing the work, we can deliver those into the steps of the process where they're needed. The scoping session, which is the first step of this process, is something that we also had that was standard work. So standard process and standard work, kind of the same thing, but they can look different. So with us, the first step in our process is we want to scope the project out. So when we were scoping the project out, we had a PowerPoint file, and we actually filled out the 6-panel charter for the scope of the project. Well, what we found is that a lot of times people had an old version of that charter or of that template, or when they got to one of the boxes, they didn't necessarily know how to fill the box out. So what we did is we created knowledge packets for it, and now the 10th knowledge packet in this particular assessment control is create the document. Because we still need the document, right? We still need to be able to communicate this to the customer, or we need it to get signed off on. But the actual knowledge behind creating that document, we turned into knowledge packets, and our application engineers now fill out this particular assessment control. And if we look at this one, you can probably guess what it's going to look like. Very similar to the other two that we saw in the beginning. So we want to make this consistent so that when users come in, they're able to evaluate information in the same format, reduce the amount of confusion that can be caused by the way that information is captured, and the assessment control and the knowledge packet are going to allow us to do that. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is how do you identify the knowledge packets that exist in these assessments? So we talked about checklists, we talked about different audit trails or places where people need to come together and track decisions that were made. We have standard processes, we have standard work. Those are the places where assessments can exist. But how do you figure out which knowledge packets or what items within those things are the knowledge packets that need to go into the assessment control? A lot of times we'll have organizations that we go to, they have a lot of documents where their information is captured, Those documents have a lot of different pieces of knowledge in them. And we'll get a question that says, well, is a knowledge packet one-for-one with a document? And our colleagues at Navistar, who are not in this room, they're in the other one, used to make fun of us all the time because we would say, well, it depends. And it sounds like we're dodging the question, right? But it actually does depend. If your one document that you have is one piece of knowledge, then yeah, it'd be one-to-one. What we generally find, though, is that one document contains multiple bits of knowledge or retained know-how. So we want to create multiple knowledge packets from that document. Well, how do you figure out or understand what pieces of information you need to pull out and to put into knowledge packets? So we're going to go through our 4 examples again. So if we start with workstation readiness, we'll go back to what our assessment control looked like. So we have all the items that were in the checklist that we're marking off. With checklists, it's pretty easy. So checklist is the easiest one to identify where an assessment would be valuable because you have a checklist that you do. And it's the easiest one to figure out what the CAPEX are because they're generally the lines in the checklist. So this Excel file that we took and turned into it, they had a line where it said, are the ergomats in place? That's the knowledge packet. What the checklist didn't have is how do you figure out where the ergomats should go? Are they in place? What is an ergomat? Maybe I'm doing this audit for the first time and I don't even know what one is. So are the safety signs posted? That was another line in the actual checklist. But how do you know whether they're posted, if they're posted properly? What we can do with the assessment control and the knowledge packet, connecting the knowledge to the place that it's actually being evaluated, is put that information directly in the flow of work. So we're going to have Jimmy open up this knowledge packet. So if I don't know where the safety signs are supposed to be, how they're supposed to be posted, how far away from the American flag do they need to be, for instance, all the background information is here in the knowledge packet itself. So we've identified that the line in the checklist is the CAPAC, and then the knowledge packet can capture the know-how behind the actual activity that you're trying to accomplish. So this is a very simple example. A lot of the examples that you see today are going to be pretty simple. We'll see some that are more elaborate tomorrow with the customer presentations, and we do something called a cool CAPAC competition. But here we can see the 3 different things that you need to check in order to make sure that these safety signs are in the right place, and there's an image showing you a properly posted safety sign. So if we go from workstation readiness now and flip to the next workflow that we had, which was the decision-making process, our assessment looks the same. We have design guides that are being written by the subject matter experts, but the designer actually needs to interact with them. They need to make sure that the engagement of the console locator pins to the hinge are within the specification. So like Jeff showed, if we go ahead and click the lightning bolt, we have values here. Instead of saying, do you meet this requirement, we're actually asking for the values associated with the requirement, and we're going to let the rules engine tell us whether we're meeting the requirement or not. So we'll go in, put our values, we'll hit evaluate and close. It's going to tell us we're not meeting the requirement. So we are adding fidelity to the information. I'm not meeting the requirement, so now I need to know how to meet the requirement. The things that Jeff had talked about, if you open up the knowledge packet, we have the background information for what that requirement is, why it exists, different ways that it can be met. We can go to the Relations tab that he showed a little bit earlier, and then we can also see the way that people have applied this in the past. So this knowledge packet is going to look very similar to the one that we just saw in Workstation Readiness. Even though a subject matter expert for a design guide wrote this, and a subject matter expert for how to post a safety sign wrote the other, we don't have one PowerPoint and one Word document. We have a knowledge packet. The visual digestion to the end user is going to be consistent, right? We have our rich text at the top, the multimedia image is in the same spot. All that effort that people have to go through to understand the document, remove all the document bloat like we talked about in the very first presentation. The knowledge packet and the template is going to allow us to do that automatically, and we're going to aid the author in their ability to do that and remove that document bloat. So we went through workstation readiness. We now have talked a little bit about the design guide. If we need to then track things for audits, everything in the assessment control is going to be tracked and saved automatically. The decisions that were made are going to be shown in our history reports and all that stuff. If you need to look back at what values were associated with this particular requirement, we can see all that. So if we go to our next example, which is the standard process, we have knowledge packets here, and the knowledge packet is the workflow. So we're going to define the way that the process should go, the different things that need to go into it, And then when we create the assessment control, we're going to track our progress through that project. So if we open up our process knowledge packet, looks very similar to what we just saw. The greens and the reds are not going to be there, but the information that needs to be evaluated at each step of the process is also available. And then when we put it into the assessment control, the representation looks very, very similar. So the document, which is going to be the knowledge, the KPAC is participating in the assessment control. So where the subject matter expert has captured the information, the end user is actually using the same thing that the subject matter expert authored. So that goes into the scoping session as well. So if we go back to our example of the scoping session, and we open up that assessment one more time, we're going to have our list of items that need to be completed. So we go through potential areas of focus, we talk about their maturity, we select one, and then we define what the actual project scope is. So if we have an application engineer that hasn't done a scoping session in a while, or maybe it's their second or third scoping session, they're not that familiar with it, they can click on our knowledge packet. We actually use these in production. This is an internal seed project that we actually completed. I believe it's done already. This one's already been completed. So we did this seed project. When we define the scope, if I'm not sure how to define the scope or what high fidelity, low fidelity, and adjacent mean, I'll open up the knowledge packet. The visual digestion is going to be similar to what we saw. There's no multimedia image, but we have the rich text. It's going to give me a definition of what high fidelity is, how do I actually define the scope, and how do we work with the customer to come up with the best way to scope the project out so that they can implement successfully. So we can see the visual digestion is the same, but if we talk about relations, some of the insights that Jeff was talking about in the initial presentation, we can start to provide information to the end users that wouldn't be possible with the document. So if we go to our Relations tab, we call this Read Across or our Occurrence Report. It's going to show us all the different ways that this particular knowledge packet was used in the past, the different projects that it was used on, the different things that we did. And the system is tracking all that information simply as a product of using the assessment control to complete the scoping document. With all the information and the data that we collect, we can then start to provide additional insights like how healthy or how well do we meet this criteria. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner of that knowledge packet, you'll see this slider bar on all the things that we show today and tomorrow. And what that's doing is it's taking all the data that people are using and it's turning it into a health characteristic of the actual knowledge itself. So do we meet this all the time? Is it done in a timely manner? How frequently are people opening it and reading it? So if we open this, we have 4 different components of that vitality score. The first one is going to be a status component. So the status component is, has the subject matter expert said this is something that should be used? So we have a lot of information that will decay over time. So if something was good maybe 5 years ago, technology's changed and those best practices are no longer needed, the author can say this is now obsolete. If it's something that's work in progress, they can also show up there. And then our vitality characteristic will adjust up and down based on the opinion of the subject matter expert. The second one is the sunset component. So our sunset component is going to be how frequently is this reviewed. So a lot of times we'll have lessons learned databases, right, where someone learned something, they go and document it, they store it in the lesson learned database, and it sits there for 4 years and no one looks at it. So then people are coming through and they want to pull that document out and they want to use it, but no one's even reviewed it for 4 years. A lot of times that'll happen. What our sunset component does is give us an indication of how long it's been there. We can set that window for how frequently we want authors to review information. And then if that window of time passes, this characteristic will go down and impact the overall score as well. So the third one is going to be our usage component. The usage component is going to say how frequently are people actually using this? How often is it in assessment controls? And how often are users actually viewing it and reading the information? I guess we can't measure whether they read it all or not, but we can measure whether they open it. And usage will be measuring those 2 things. And then the fourth one, which a lot of people oftentimes think is the most important component of our vitality score or of knowledge management, is non-conformance. So of all the times it's being used, in comparison to its peers, how frequently are we not meeting that requirement? So here we can see the reason that we have a 91 and not 100 is because 71% of the time we struggle with defining the scope. So that's all within a window of significance. It's compared to its peers. So this vitality score is not impacted based on something that might be written in one of our other communities. But once those 4 components are tracked and measured by the system, the composite gets put together for the top. And Jimmy, if you mouse over the composite vitality score text, it'll tell us the different scores and then the weight that go into calculating the 91. So to recap everything, if we go back to our learning points, we wanted to talk about how do you identify where assessment controls exist in your organization. So we said anywhere that a checklist is used, it's a good place that you could use an assessment control. Anywhere that decisions need to be made and you have multiple stakeholders coming together to make decisions that need to be tracked and potentially audited is the second place that you can use an assessment control. Then anywhere that you have standard work or standard process, assessment controls can help to ensure that that standard work is happening consistently and the process is being followed the way that it's been designed. We talked a little bit about what they look like. How do you identify knowledge packets? So with the checklist, it's easy. It's the lines within the checklist or the items within the checklist. With the decision-making process or the audit trail, what are the things that are being audited? What are the things that need to be communicated to the designer, so to speak, that they need to take into account when they're designing their part? Those are the things that generally we'll see turned into knowledge packets. For standard process, what are the steps in your process? It's pretty straightforward. Standard work, what are the items within that standard work? So when we do our charter, we want to scope the project out, we want to define the scope, define the team, all those kinds of things. And at the last step of the process, we want to actually produce the chartering document. So does anyone have any questions about how this stuff applies to your organization, the different things that you're struggling with as you start to potentially employ a solution like Auros? Yeah, Ryan, I'll bring a mic over to you real quick. If you do have a question, raise your hand. And
okay, my question is, if you have a K-pack, can you use another K-pack to use as a decision-making based on the previous K-pack instead of like a data table within the same K-pack?
Yeah, so what we have is the value tables, when we create them and we author them individually, the parameters that exist in that value table, a lot of times we think of CAD models when we start talking about this, but it really can be applied to any concept. Those parameters, when they're in an assessment control, can be used in multiple different decisions that are made. So if you have the thickness of a part, and it applies to where the hinge goes, and it also applies to how they're assembled. The thickness of the part can be put into the rule or in the value table in that functional model of the knowledge. And then when you put the value for the thickness of the part in, it'll participate in multiple different rules, and it'll start to communicate those things across the rules that you're trying to adhere to. Did that answer your question? Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yeah.
Is that right? Where you got the value for the console. So if I'm an engineer, how do I know? I just know that because I'm an engineer that I put in those parameters and then you run the evaluate.
Yeah, so what we did up here is we manually are putting those values in, right? And we have customers that will do it in a number of different ways. Some people have a model-based system, right, where they have those values coming from the system. Auros then connects to that system, the values are communicated, and the evaluations are completed. We have that type of interaction, but it can start, and where we say it generally start, is people have their checklist or their assessment control, and they're putting those values in based on the work they're doing. So whether it's a CAD model, whether it's interaction with the customer about what the specifications are, that information gets put into the system and the rule processing engine processes the rule. But what Jeff was talking about earlier is we're moving to a world that's more model-based, and if you organize and you document your knowledge in this fashion, the rules around the way that work gets done can be communicated with the model as opposed to requiring the manual interaction. But we use manual interaction here.
I'm working with Josh right now, so this is, so if you want to create a knowledge packet, is that manual or can you import some of those in like you and I were talking about, some of the activity cards that we're using?
Right.
Do I manually put those in or can I? import them? I know one of you guys.
Yeah. So this is a question we get all the time. This looks like a lot of work, right? We've got a lot of knowledge. It's captured right now. How am I going to get all of our information into these knowledge packets? So what we find is one of two things. Well, I guess two things. One, it's not as difficult as it seems because we have ways to automate taking that information and turning it into knowledge packets. But the thing that's a little bit more important and maybe not as intuitive, when you capture your knowledge in a document, and we'll talk about this in the breakout session at 3 o'clock actually, the way that it's captured in a document has a lot of different failure points. So what we don't want to do, and we tell our application engineers this all the time, our tagline or our marketing line is we want to transform the way that knowledge is captured, shared, and reused. So we actually don't want to take those documents and just import them as knowledge packets. What we want to do is we want to start to use this knowledge-aware approach of capturing the information that needs to be evaluated and then let the process of evaluation vet the knowledge out so that it can be actionable, it can be up to date. We'll talk about the different failure modes of a document at the next session. But the first thing we do is we transfer it over, and that's typically what we'll do is we'll do the import and we'll just do the direct dump of information. But as we work through the seed projects and we start to change the way we think about capturing knowledge, the way that we capture it and the way that it gets documented in those knowledge packets is going to be very different from the way it looks in a document that you might have in a shared drive or somewhere.
You might have hit on this when you were talking about it, but in the evaluation scores, the sunset portion, is there some way to tell that it's not been accessed or not been used, or it's met its time frame limit, and whoever was the author needs to be notified and decide whether or not that should be revisited, and can it be removed then if it's no longer important?
Right, so we don't automatically remove anything. We do require the subject matter experts, the authors, to go in and say this is obsolete or delete the knowledge packet, whatever you might decide to do. But the sunset algorithm, we can set it anywhere from 3 to 2 years, 3 months to 2 years. So if you want people reviewing their knowledge every 3 months and you want them to be really diligent about making sure that things are accurate, then we can do that. What happens as that time frame passes, there's a couple of different activities in Auros that are considered a sunset reset. And it's if the author opens it up for edit, and then there's a manual resetting of the date. So an author can go in and say, yeah, that's still up to date, so reset. So to answer your question, Doug, I guess about as time goes by and the information starts to decay or potentially decay, how does the author know? We have a couple different reports that you can run and you can access that'll show you which knowledge packets in your community of practice are past their sunset date. And then as that number gets down to a certain level, we start to send notifications to the authors. I believe it's the authors within the community. And we do it within the community because if the author who actually wrote it is no longer there, then someone needs to get that notification. But they'll get an email notification or a notification within our software tool that tells them this particular piece of knowledge is past the sunset date.